Hello, I'd like to welcome you to iNN's Headline News and Beyond for April 5th, 2012. A little bit of a disclaimer here that we come to you about a day after the actual headlines appear because we do need the time. We're not here simply to bring you the headlines, to be a mouthpiece or whatever. We're here to give you some insight into what's actually going on behind the scenes so that you can get a proper understanding of what's actually going on and then make your own decisions. As I've stated before, every reporter out there, no matter how unbiased they say they are, and this includes myself, has a degree of bias. And while we can go and analyze others' biases, you've got to sit down and do the research eventually yourself. And this is why I put up some documentaries that I've put up by Daniel Yergin. Again, another perspective on these issues here. This is particularly on the issue of oil and how oil impacts and affects a lot of the policy and politics that go on in this world. Oil has been behind a lot of the major policies, including major historical events in the world. And it's not simply that it's not something that sort of, oh, it's oil and just sort of leave it alone. But if you watch this documentary, even though again it's from one person's perspective, and there's more that could be gotten into as a primer, as a reference, as a beginning point, this is a great place to start. So, with that being said, because we are dealing now we're in the primary, we're going to the presidential race. We hear a lot about constitutional issues, about rights issues, and so on and so forth. So I thought that it would be good if we begin with, I said I've picked out three amendments from the Constitution, from the Bill of Rights, that sort of sum up a large chunk of the issues that we see today, and are going to be playing a significant role in the coming election, because you'll see this trotted out on both sides. The first one is the First Amendment, and this is the one everyone knows is free speech. But it's more than just free speech. It includes freedom of religion, freedom of thought. It's an encompassing thing that gives the basis for all other freedoms, sits in the First Amendment. And this is why the First Amendment is so important, because it is the basis from which all other freedoms stem. And it states, and this is our particular point, is that we're not only do we have a freedom of religion, and it says here specifically, and I read this the way it comes out, and this is for freedom of speech. It says, as Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. Well, if you've been watching both sides of this argument, particularly on Trayvon Martin case, you'll know they've been talking about certain words, and oh, there's the N word that they can't say on the air, or this word. There are now words that cannot be said on the air because of the political censorship that's going on from the left, from the Social Democrats, and this is their proper term because they have moved enough to the left. They are in the Social Democrat definition. And a large chunk of their rhetoric includes a restriction of terms that they consider to be insensitive to a particular group who face certain issues. And it's really based on perception, not any reality, because once again, this whole thing of hate speech and hate crime, and this is what you'll hear from the social left, and this is Obama, this is Al Sharpton, and a lot of the arguments you'll hear on CNN, and as I checked on MSNBC, and Bill O'Reilly was right, MSNBC, what I've seen so far, is significantly to the left. They're not just a little bit to the left, they're significantly to the left. They'll talk about hate speech, hate crime, but hate speech and hate crime only applies to uh, a certain segment of the population called visible minorities. There are other minorities out there who are invisible, but only these visible minorities are entitled to have these special protections. It's not that the other invisible minorities are sort of well off or not under threat. It just the ruling elite of the social left, the intellectuals, feel that these are the representative groups that they want to pay attention to, and they really don't. And this is true to a large extent. They don't see the other minorities. These other minorities are invisible to them. They have no concept or understanding of these other minorities outside of the so-called visible minority spectrum. And as I said, a large chunk of the social left comes from this sort of Western thought intellectual base, and this is sort of what you'll hear a lot about this, about the intellectual left, about the intellectual elite, and their views. And it's a bizarre view, because although they are elite, although they are silver spooned, they try to pretend that they have a commonality with the average man, with the average person. And I think it doesn't matter whether or not at one point in time you were at a particular position. It's the position and the way you think now, as you're speaking to things, that really matter. Because if you have rejected everything you had in the past, you hide who you were in the past, being viewed as, because you sometimes maybe view it as being ignorant or uneducated and so on and so forth, then there is a whole segment of society that is rejected along with it. And a lot of the academic left, and the left is primarily academic, or view themselves as academic, have this sort of locked-in mentality where their reality, which is the academic world, and because that's their reality, the outside world seems nonsensical and illogical to them. And they will represent and describe what they have not experienced in these derogatory and often offensive terms, as a sort of an attempt. It's basically, if you want to get down to the very simple nitty-gritty of it, the left uses their intelligence, or their perceived intelligence, to bully the right, or those who disagree with their own thoughts and beliefs, as ignorant, uneducated, moronic, and they will even use the term rural, country bumpkin. The Greeks have a term horiatica, meaning village-minded, and it's used as a derogatory. It's a negative. It's an offensive term designed to denigrate and belittle the person that you think is not as significant as you are. In other words, you have a particular intelligent position that the person beneath you in this village doesn't have. You start calling him these particular village terms. And the left is, as much as they are against cyberbullying and talk about inclusions, they are the first people in their speech, and you can see this all over the news, who will immediately step into this sort of verbal assault, degrading those who do not think like they do. Now, the Republicans, who never pretended or assumed themselves to be inclusive, they were predominantly white. They were predominantly, what they considered to be Christian, even though functionally speaking, the Christian right really isn't Christian. There's a huge contradiction with the Christian right in that if you go back and you study the early texts of Christianity in the original Greek form, because it came out of the Roman Empire at the time where Greek was the common language. It's not that it was a locally Greek thing. It was that it was more of what they call an international Greek language that was common all across the area of the Middle East and somewhat into Europe. Although not too far into Europe. Most of Europe at the time of the early Christian church very simply just didn't exist. There was no civilization there. The European civilization wouldn't begin and evolve until almost 1,000 years afterwards. So what a lot of the Christian right consists to be Christianity is something that evolved 1,000 years afterwards and is based and rooted not in the original Eastern Christianity, but in the Western Christianity that evolved 1,000 years afterwards. So the Christian right is a European Christianity where the original Christianity was not a European Christianity. European Christianity and the original Christianity are fundamentally different. There are fundamental differences between the two. That in many cases, if you get into the theology, you can see that the theologies in many cases are contradictory and place certain limits and restrictions that didn't exist if you looked at the original theology. One example of this is the focus on law and order and of the importance of government and the importance and adherence to law. They're talking about the Ten Commandments as the laws and the way they adhere to it back. And what they'll do is that the Western right, the Christian right, will almost exclusively exclude the first 1,000 years of Christianity and skip all the way back to the Old Testament to find a lot of the justifications for the different ways they believe about how people should be treated when they are sinners. The problem with that is if you look at what occurred in the first 1,000 years of Christianity, you'll find that the treatment of these sinners was actually contradictory to what we see in the West. For example, you as a Christian, as an early Christian, because Christianity was a matter of free will, you could never force somebody at a point of a sword into Christianity. Because love can't be forced. It's something that has to grow and needs to be organic. You cannot force it on somebody or impose it on somebody. It can't be forced or imposed. It needs to be an organic growth. And if you look even into, you look at this writing by some of these early historians like Bede, and you can find these in Penguin Classics and a lot of classics, and look at the classical history of England, and you'll find that what they call the conversion of the English people, not to be in the style of what we consider to be Western conversion. It's more of an Eastern style conversion, where people weren't forced to be anything. What they did is that the people moved into the area, the Christians moved into the area, these particular monks and stuff moved into the area, and they lived about their daily lives. And as people asked the questions, well, what are you, who are you, what do you believe, they answered the questions. And so the witness to Christianity was themselves and their own behaviors. This is contradicted by the conversions that you see today, the concept of conversion that you see today, particularly in the Christians, where they're out there screaming at you. And in the early part of the Western Christianity, when you have the Crusades, and you see the Roman Catholic Church riding into areas, conquering them, and forcing the people in the area under their brand of Christianity. This is what you can see this in the Crusades. You can see this in the Battle of Hastings. There is a whole history behind this that leads into why the Christian right particularly when the Republicans behave the way they do. But that you can argue, if you go into the full history of Christianity, you can say that this is contradictory to the first 1,000 years. And this is why that first 1,000 years is more often than not sort of done away with. It's sort of tossed out. And most of the evangelical right, when they do their Bible studies, will go right back to the Old Testament, and you'll hear a lot of quotations, particularly from the Old Testament, rather than going to a lot of the church doctrines, a lot of the church books, and there are a lot of church books still around from the first 1,000 years. A lot of these first books seem to be basically tossed out by the Christian right, and a lot of these books have a completely and fundamentally different way of dealing with personal moral issues. Now, this doesn't, and the thing is, just because there's a different way of dealing with the personal moral issues, that doesn't mean that that Christianity has ever condoned moral lapses. And moral lapses, again, become an important component of theology, because how theology defines how you believe, your belief in God. Your morals are based in this, and then your morals determine what laws you consider to be just and unjust. So there is a context to which laws in society sit in, and that is theology, morality, and then constitutionality, then legality. This is the context that things sit in. If you are a theist, or a person who believes in God, and you have a theology that's specific to a god or many gods, then your morality will evolve from this, and then the laws subsequently and the constitutionality will evolve as well from that. If you are and these laws will be specific. There will be specific things to the theology that you can be seen in the law. And this is why between different theology, but let's say between the Catholics and the Protestants, you have this war. And this is a lot was fought in Ireland over these things, between the Protestants and the Roman Catholics, over how these laws would and should be shaped. This is the argument and the cause of conflict between the various different Muslim groups. When you see Muslim bombing Muslims, the issue is based on this concept of morality that stems from their understanding of their theology. Consequently, when we look at the social left, who are fundamentally atheistic and view everything as a concept, then their morality is no longer an individual morality or a set morality, but rather a social morality. And for them, they believe in social justice. And it's the social issues that drive their issues of the day. And that can be a variety of things, and as one issue lapses and another issues come up, their morality changes with the changes in the views and perspectives of society, and so far, and so in the way you can define them, their definition, this meets the definition of an amoral or a pluralistically moral person, a person who has multiple and even contradictory morals. This means in some cases it will be fine to murder and massacre people, while in other cases, because it's against that morality of the day, it is not not okay to murder and massacre another group. So you can have one group over here who are socially moral and to murder and kill, and then you have, on the other hand, you can have a group who's not socially acceptable to murder and kill. And this forms the morality of social justice. And this can be seen in the case when we go back to Rachel Maddow, and this is the show that I looked at from MSNBC, that when the Republicans are out there fighting against the law on abortion, and this is the fault of the Republicans themselves now. They don't come out and state specifically why they're against the law of why they're against abortion. They don't come out and state and call their opponents who are supporting abortion murderers. But this is exactly what people who support abortion are. They're murderers. You're killing people based on a social standard or a social moral. And I'll give you an example. In socialism, you look at the history of socialism. You look at Hitler. You look at Stalin. You look at the leaders of the Khmer Rouge. And you can place Obama and a lot of the socialist leaders. And this is where Bill O'Reilly will say the wrong thing to do is to demonize Obama. Well, you don't have to demonize him. All you have to do is place him within the context of history. And if you understand the context in which history, and particularly socialism, evolved in history, then you will see that Hitler and Stalin had defined groups of people who were defective and socially acceptable to murder. This is what I'm talking about. In every social society, because socialism is geared and based on this concept of a global socialist utopia, a correction and a engineering of society, there are certain groups within the society and individuals who are sacrificed for the benefit or the greater good of society. This is the fundamental tenet of socialism. And when you hear someone talk about social justice and any of these other social causes or the socially relevant issues of the day, this is at the basis of their belief. And this is why when you heard and this wasn't publicized in a lot of the mainstream American media, but it was out in some of the foreign media that you could sort of find this out. And a lot of the information you can't find in the American media. You have to go outside to other foreign sources to find, even when they're talking about stuff that's going on in the United States. And this is one of the things is that we had CNN's Jeffrey Toobin on Anderson Cooper, another sort of a creative journalist who creates his own stories, was talking about how absurd it was to call Obama's comments about the Supreme Court, attacking the Supreme Court and the justices on the Supreme Court. Yet, if you went into the BBC and all the papers across the UK, you went into Al Jazeera, into all these other papers, and all the other news sources around the world, even the Bangkok Times called Obama's actions an attack on the Supreme Court of Justice. So it's so what happens is that you have a lot of journalistic creationism going on within the American media, and a lot of the stories that are supposed to get out don't get out, or are belittled in such a manner that one of the manners of sort of dismissing arguments is, rather than actually presenting a solid, good argument with a good historical backing, a good historical context, what they'll do is they'll simply dismiss it and treat it as a as a comical or a amusing issue, and they'll laugh it off as and the dismissal, the counter argument is this laughing, mocking dismissal. And this is exactly what Rachel Maddow does. Is she talks about the issue of abortion as an attack on women, but it's not an attack on women. The issue of abortion is an attack on the human being. It's just at this particular point in time, under Obama, rather than having the human being defined that is acceptable to be eliminated, being a Jew, it's now a baby. And you can see again through all these different socialist values there, these throughout the socialist history, one group or another have always been defined as subhuman or not sufficient or beneficial to the greater society, and therefore therefore is a moral imperative that we eliminate this minority in order that be better or for progress. And this is why, in many cases, the socialists, the social left, are also called progressives, because their goal is the progression of society and social values in this great socialist utopia. And what Obama is guilty of is he's guilty of supporting and working with those who have dehumanized the human life within the womb, and it is a separate entity. And the thing is, I am going to say here, because again, Rachel Maddow says that most Republicans, that Republicans are people who are against science, and no, they're not against science. I'm not necessarily a Republican. I'm on the right. I'm a Christian, but I'm not of the European Christian. I'm of the Eastern Christian variety. I'm part of the invisible minority that I've been talking about. And the thing is, I'm also an astrophysicist, and I know that inside from my medical research experience that the life in the womb is a separate entity, and that there is a discussion, because we still don't know when this life is sufficiently independent to say that this is a life and it can be gotten rid of. Because there's also an argument, and again, the academic elite who argue that we we have no God, there is no God, and that human beings have no soul. The issue comes out is that when does the soul enter into the body? At what point in time not are you only killing the physical material of the body, but are you killing the soul as well? I mean, in terms of the actions that occur against the person. And all this argument, and this is again the abortion argument, doesn't have to be brought back to a Christian point. All you have to do is go back to Hippocrates in ancient Greece, who was an idolater. He believed in the 12 gods of Olympus, and you can see right there in the writing of Hippocrates, the Hippocratic Oath, that all medical physicians, any doctor takes who becomes an MD, specifically curses any medical doctor who takes a life, including those of the baby that is still within the womb. So this is not a Christian document. This is a non-Christian document. This is a idol worshiper, an idolater, but a doctor at that, saying that this is morally wrong. And the thing is, the social left, unfortunately, does not have history on its side. It cannot turn to history and say, "Here's where I stand, and here is how my ideas are supported in history," because they have to toss away history. Their views and their social values are ambiguous and don't stand in any one particular way or another, because everything is viewed as a concept. Yet what Rachel Maddow does is simply belittle and, in an arrogant manner, just simply toss off the opposition, the Republican opposition, as laughable and clownish. In other words, there is what I said in earlier as the left's derogatory manner towards anything and anyone who does not believe the way they do. This is exactly what's represented in Rachel Maddow's show. Is throughout the entire show, there's not even an attempt to bring in any form of proper balance at all. Where if you go to Bill O'Reilly's show, he doesn't go. He's not, even though he does have his tendencies and he does have his biases, they're not in the same manner that you see that I've seen in Rachel Maddow's show. So when he calls MSNBC, and I also found the quote from the Associated Press, that there is a bias there and that there is a media push for socialism. You can say that it's true, but I can also show you that historically this has always been true. The love of the press for the social left, for socialism, has always been there. There is a historical connection between socialism, communism, and your average reporter. And that's something that can be seen in history, and I will, at some point in time, pull all the information that I have here together in my library and produce a little documentary showing the connection between the left and the reporters. Anyways, we're going to go on to our second half now. I will see you on the other side in a few minutes.